The war had ended, but the silence after battle carried its own weight. Across the stars, a great empire of alien royals celebrated their triumph. Their banners hung across the marble halls of their palace. Their voices rose in pride, claiming that the galaxy now belonged to them. Soldiers bowed, courtiers cheered, and nobles raised cups of gold to honor their strength. At the center of their celebration stood a figure who did not share their joy. A young woman from the rival world had been brought into the chamber. She walked slowly, her steps guided by guards. She did not fight back. She had no strength left. Her people had been defeated, their cities burned, and their leaders scattered. The victors called her the greatest prize of the war. The royals displayed her before the court. They spoke of her beauty, her noble blood, and the meaning she carried. To them she was not a person but a trophy, a symbol that even the proudest of enemies could be broken and owned. The king raised his hand and announced that she would serve as proof of their glory. Laughter and applause filled the air. She stood in silence, her eyes lowered, though her heart burned inside. Her name was Lyra, though few spoke it. To the royals, she was simply the prize. They placed a crown of silver on her head, not to honor her but to show ownership. The crown was heavy, and so was the chain that followed her wherever she went. Every step she took in that palace reminded her of what had been lost. She remembered her home world, its forests of shining crystal trees and skies painted with silver clouds. All of it had fallen to the flames of war. Days turned into weeks, and the palace became her cage. She ate what they gave her, wore the robes they chose, and stood when they ordered her to stand. She spoke little, for every word felt like surrender. When she was alone, she tried to hold memories of her family close. Yet even those memories began to blur, fading under the weight of captivity. The royals took pride in showing her to guests. Ambassadors from other systems came to witness the prize of war. They would bow to the king, then glance at her as if she were part of the decoration. Some whispered that she was rare, valuable, and that no other empire had ever captured such a prize. The young woman felt like her spirit was being carved away piece by piece. One evening, during another celebration, the queen spoke with her council. They had gained much from war, yet they wanted more. They wished to secure peace with humanity, the rising power on the edge of the stars. The humans had not fought in this war, but their fleets and armies were growing strong. The royals decided that sending the prize to Earth would show generosity. They would present her as a gift to the humans, a way of saying, "We share our triumph with you." The decision was made quickly, without her voice. She was told she would leave the palace, and the courtiers whispered that perhaps she should be grateful. After all, Earth was not under the same strict rule as the Empire. Yet to her, it sounded like another cage, another place where her worth would be measured by what she represented, not who she was. The journey began with silence. She was placed in a sleek vessel, guarded by soldiers who looked at her with the same cold pride. As the stars stretched outside the windows, she sat alone, wondering if freedom would ever be hers again. The thought of Earth did not bring hope, only uncertainty. She imagined new chains, new masters, and new halls where she would stand as a prize for others to admire. But deep within her heart, there remained a spark. It was small and fragile, but it refused to die. She had lived through loss and carried scars of grief, yet she still dreamed that one day she would be seen as more than a symbol. She longed for someone who would look into her eyes and see not a prize of war but a person with a soul. The vessel moved through space, carrying her closer to Earth. She had no idea what awaited her there. She did not know the name of the man who would open his door to her, or the simple gifts he would place in her life. For now, she only sat in silence, chained by fate, unaware that her journey was about to change everything. The royals believed they had secured loyalty with their prize. They believed they had shown greatness by sending her away. Yet the truth would surprise them. Humanity's strength was not in crowns, banners, or palaces. It was in the quiet kindness of ordinary people, and soon she would see it for herself. The ship descended quietly through Earth's atmosphere, its silver hull shining against the morning sky. The young alien woman sat in the chamber, her hands folded on her lap. She did not know what to expect from this new world. She had been told little by her guards. All she understood was that she was being given away once again, this time to humans. To her, it felt no different from being passed from one owner to another. When the door of the ship opened, warm air touched her face. She saw blue skies, green trees, and simple buildings spread across the land. It was nothing like the grand palaces of the royals, but there was a strange beauty in its simplicity. Birds flew across the open space, and the sound of children laughing echoed faintly in the distance. It felt alive in a way the marble halls of the empire never did. Waiting outside stood a small group of humans. Some wore dark uniforms, their faces serious as they observed the arrival. Among them was one man who stood a little apart. His uniform was plain, and his posture carried no pride of power. His name was Mason, a soldier who had served quietly during the human defense campaigns. Unlike the officials, he did not look at her as though she were a prize. His eyes carried only calm curiosity. The alien guards led her forward and spoke formally to the humans. They explained that she was a gift of peace, a sign of goodwill between the Empire and Earth. The officials nodded politely, but it was clear that the meaning behind the gift was heavy. No one wished to take responsibility for her, yet someone had to. That was when Mason stepped forward. His orders were simple: take her in, provide shelter, and watch over her. The young woman lowered her head, expecting commands, expecting chains or rules to follow. Instead, Mason only spoke a single line. "Come with me. You must be tired." His voice was steady but gentle. She hesitated, surprised by the lack of force, then followed him. They traveled by a ground vehicle, moving through winding roads lined with fields and small houses. She sat quietly, her hands resting on her knees, while Mason kept his eyes on the road. He did not ask her to speak, and he did not question her past. For the first time, silence felt different. It was not filled with judgment or orders. It was simply silence. When they arrived, Mason led her into a modest home at the edge of a quiet town. The house was small, built of brick with a simple garden in front. Inside, the rooms were warm and filled with ordinary objects. A table with books, a kitchen with the faint smell of bread, and in the center of the living room stood a large sofa. She looked at it with confusion. It seemed soft, yet she could not understand its purpose. Mason noticed her gaze. He placed his bag on the floor and gestured toward the sofa. "You can sit there. It is comfortable." She hesitated, unsure if she was allowed. On her world, one never sat without permission. When she remained standing, Mason gave a small nod. "It is yours if you want it. No one will stop you." Slowly, carefully, she lowered herself onto the cushions. The surface gave way beneath her, soft and warm, unlike any seat she had known before. She placed her hands on the fabric, pressing lightly, almost as if testing whether it was real. For the first time since her capture, her shoulders eased. She sank back and closed her eyes. The air in the room felt safe, and her body relaxed in a way she had forgotten was possible. Mason walked into the kitchen and poured water into a glass. He set it on the table near her without a word. She opened her eyes, surprised again. He was not treating her like a prize. He was treating her like a guest. The evening passed quietly. Mason showed her where she could rest, pointing to a room prepared with blankets and a bed. She stepped inside, touched the pillow, and turned slowly in a circle. It was not a palace chamber, but it was hers alone. No guards stood at the door, no chains rested on her wrists. The silence in this room was gentle, not heavy. Before leaving her to rest, Mason spoke once more. "This house is safe. No one here will command you. If you need something, tell me. That is all." She stared at him, uncertain how to respond. Words rose in her throat but caught before reaching her lips. Finally, she gave a small nod. That night, lying on the bed, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. She was still far from free in her heart, yet there was something different in this place. For the first time, she felt a spark of hope. Maybe Earth would not be another cage. Maybe the soldier, with his quiet ways and simple home, would show her a life that was more than survival. As she drifted into sleep, her last thought was of the sofa. A simple piece of furniture to most, but to her it was a symbol. It was the first thing in years that had been offered without condition. It was not a throne or a chain. It was a seat of peace. Morning light entered through the curtains of Mason's small home. The young woman awoke to the soft warmth of the sun touching her face. For a moment she forgot where she was, half expecting the cold walls of the alien palace. But when she sat up, she saw the plain room, the neat bed, and the quiet space that belonged to her alone. It was simple, but it carried a peace she had not known for years. She stepped out into the living room and saw Mason already awake. He was seated at the table, a cup of coffee in his hands. He did not look at her as though waiting for her to speak. He only gave a small nod, as if to say good morning without words. The air between them was calm, free of demand. Her eyes drifted again to the sofa. The memory of the night before returned the strange comfort, the way her body had melted into it. She had not understood why it mattered so much, but something inside her had shifted. The sofa was not just a seat. It was a gift of rest, something no royal or conqueror had ever thought to give her. Mason noticed her gaze and spoke in his steady voice. "You like it, don't you?" She hesitated, then gave a small nod. Words still felt heavy to her, but she wanted to answer honestly. Mason smiled faintly. "It is nothing special. Just a sofa. But it is yours whenever you want it." The idea of something being hers was strange. In the palace, nothing had belonged to her, not even her own time. Here, Mason was offering her a piece of his home without question. She touched the fabric lightly and sat down again. The cushions pressed softly against her frame, wrapping her in comfort. She allowed herself to lean back and breathe. Mason went to the kitchen and began preparing food. The sound of pans and the smell of cooking filled the house. She watched him with curiosity. On her world, meals had been grand affairs, served by many hands under strict rituals. Here, a single man cooked with quiet ease. When he placed a plate of eggs and bread before her, she looked at it as though it were a rare treasure. "Eat," Mason said simply. She picked up the fork and tasted it. The flavor was warm and plain, but it carried something more. It was made not to impress or control but to nourish. She finished slowly, each bite reminding her that she was being cared for in a way she had never expected. After breakfast, Mason turned on a device in the living room. The screen lit up, showing moving images. She tilted her head, puzzled. Mason explained, "It is called television. People watch stories here. This is a service called Netflix. You will see dramas, comedies, even history. It is how many of us spend quiet evenings." He handed her the remote and let her press the buttons. At first she struggled, but when the images shifted and sounds filled the room, her eyes widened. She watched people laugh, cry, and live through tales that were both strange and familiar. She did not understand everything, yet she felt the emotions deeply. One scene made her laugh unexpectedly. The sound startled her. She had not laughed freely since her childhood. Mason glanced at her and smiled again. "See? It is good to laugh. Life is not only war and duty." She lowered the remote slowly, her chest rising with a feeling she could not name. The sofa beneath her, the screen before her, the food in her stomach, these were small things, yet they carried weight. They reminded her of something her captors had never understood: peace was built from ordinary moments, not from crowns or chains. In the days that followed, she began to grow used to the rhythm of the house. She would wake to the sun, eat the food Mason prepared, and spend hours exploring the endless stories on the screen. Sometimes Mason joined her, sometimes he worked outside, but he never forced her into anything. His quiet presence was steady, like a wall that would not fall. She also began to speak more. At first it was only a word or two. "Thank you." "Yes." "No," but Mason never rushed her. Each time she spoke, he listened as if every word mattered. Slowly, she felt her voice return, stronger than before. One evening, as she rested on the sofa, she turned to him and asked softly, "Why do you treat me like this?" Mason looked at her with calm eyes. "Because you are a person, not a prize." Her throat tightened. No one had said that to her since the war began. The truth of it sank deep inside her heart. She realized then that the sofa was more than furniture. It was a symbol of how humans lived, offering space, comfort, and kindness without demand. As night fell, she lay on the sofa and pulled a blanket over herself. Mason turned off the lights and left her to rest. In the darkness, she thought about the path that had brought her here. She was still unsure of her future, but for the first time, she believed it might hold more than chains. The sofa had given her more than peace. It had given her hope. The days in Mason's house began to shape themselves into a rhythm that felt both new and comforting to the young woman. Each morning, sunlight touched the curtains, birds sang outside, and the air smelled fresh and calm. She no longer woke in fear of footsteps in the hall or the sound of a guard's command. Instead, she woke to silence that belonged to her. Mason had returned to his ordinary routines. He rose early, cooked simple meals, and sometimes worked in the small garden outside. He never treated her as a burden or as someone who needed to be watched. He gave her space, letting her decide where to sit, what to eat, and when to rest. At first this freedom confused her. She was used to strict schedules and endless demands. Slowly, she began to explore what freedom meant. The sofa remained her favorite place. It was where she first felt safe, and it became her corner of peace. She often curled into it, watching the endless stories on the glowing screen Mason called Netflix. At first she watched quietly, her face serious as she studied the strange tales of humans. But over time, her expression began to change. She smiled at playful characters, frowned at villains, and laughed at jokes she never thought she would understand. Mason noticed her laughter one evening. He was sitting nearby, reading a book, when she suddenly let out a small burst of joy at a scene on the screen. She quickly covered her mouth, embarrassed, as if she had broken a rule. Mason lowered his book and said, "It is good to laugh. You should never hide that." She lowered her hand slowly, her eyes softening. "On my world," she said quietly, "laughter was rare. Only children laughed freely. Adults did not." Mason leaned back in his chair. "Then maybe it is time to change that. Here, people laugh whenever they can. It helps carry the weight of life." His words stayed with her. That night, when she lay in bed, she thought of the sound of her own laughter. It felt strange and fragile, yet warm. She promised herself she would not let it disappear again. Another day, Mason brought home a basket of fruits and bread from the local market. He placed it on the table and invited her to try. She touched the fruit carefully, its skin smooth and colorful. When she bit into it, sweet juice filled her mouth. She blinked in surprise, her eyes bright. Mason chuckled. "You like it?" She nodded quickly, taking another bite. Simple food, yet it carried joy she had forgotten existed. She realized that on her world, meals had always been about duty and display. Here, meals were about sharing and living. Over time, she began to join Mason in small tasks. She helped water the plants in the garden, learning how to hold the can and sprinkle the soil. She asked him about the names of flowers and vegetables. When she repeated the names, he corrected her gently, his voice calm and steady. Each small act gave her a sense of belonging, something she had not felt in years. One afternoon, Mason showed her something new. He turned on music from a small speaker and let the notes fill the room. She tilted her head, listening. The sounds were soft and rhythmic, carrying emotions she could not put into words. Mason said, "This is music. People make it to express what they feel." She closed her eyes and listened carefully. Her body swayed slightly, almost without her realizing it. Mason did not laugh at her or interrupt. He let her feel the music in her own way. When the song ended, she whispered, "It feels like freedom." Mason nodded. That is what it is meant to feel like. Every discovery, no matter how small, added to her sense of healing. She began to understand that humanity's strength did not come only from weapons or armies. It came from the ability to find joy in ordinary things: food, music, stories, and laughter. It was a strength that could not be measured by crowns or banners. One evening, as the sun set, she sat on the sofa with Mason nearby. The screen glowed with another story, but her attention drifted. She looked around the room, at the books, the plants, and the simple warmth of the house. She thought of the alien palace where she had once stood like a statue, admired but never respected. This home was not grand, yet it was alive. She turned to Mason and spoke softly. "Why do you share these things with me? You do not know me." Mason set down his book and met her eyes. "Because you deserve a life. Not as a prize, not as a symbol, but as yourself. Everyone deserves that." Her heart tightened. She had no answer, only silence. But inside her, something began to mend. For the first time since her capture, she believed she was more than what the royals had called her. She was not only a prize of war. She was a person who could laugh, eat, learn, and live. That night, as she lay on the sofa instead of the bed, She pulled the blanket over herself and closed her eyes. The screen's light faded, but her mind was filled with the sound of laughter, music, and Mason's words. These were the small joys of humanity, and they were slowly teaching her the meaning of home. Far away from Earth, the alien royals continued their rule with pride. They believed their victory was unquestioned and their empire unshaken. In their eyes, sending the young woman to Earth had been a generous act, a way to prove their greatness while securing ties with humans. To them, she remained a prize, nothing more than a symbol to be displayed in another court. Weeks passed before word reached the palace of how the young woman lived on Earth. At first, the report seemed small, carried by traders and envoys who visited human settlements. They spoke of her not as a captive, but as someone who walked freely. They described her sitting on a sofa, sharing food, and even laughing at human stories shown on a glowing screen. At first the royals dismissed the rumors, thinking them false or exaggerated. Yet more accounts followed, all describing the same truth. The queen grew restless. She could not understand how a prize of war could live in such a manner. She was meant to show our power, the queen said to her court. How can she bring honor to us if she spends her days resting in a soldier's home like a common guest? The king was equally displeased. He believed her loyalty should remain tied to the empire, even if she was far away. He called for envoys to confirm the truth. When the envoys arrived on Earth, they expected to see her dressed in silks, standing beside human leaders, praised as a treasure of peace. Instead, they found her sitting calmly on a sofa, a blanket draped over her shoulders. The human soldier Mason was nearby, reading a book. The scene was quiet, simple, and ordinary. Yet to the envoys, it was shocking. One envoy stepped forward and demanded, "Why do you sit in such a low place? You are the prize of our great empire. You should be honored, not hidden in this small dwelling." The young woman raised her head and looked at them. Her eyes carried no fear, only calm strength. "I am not hidden," she said. "I am living." The words unsettled the envoys. They turned to Mason, expecting him to explain or defend. But Mason simply closed his book and said, "She is free here. That is all." The envoys returned to the palace with heavy hearts, unsure how to present their report. When they described what they had seen, the court erupted in disbelief. Nobles shouted that the humans must be twisting her mind. Others said the soldier had bewitched her with strange earth customs. The queen listened in silence, but her eyes narrowed. She understood that something far more dangerous was happening. "This is not about comfort or furniture," the queen finally said. "This is about loyalty. If she no longer sees herself as our prize, then our power weakens. Others may begin to believe that humanity holds something greater than we do." The thought spread fear among the royals. Their empire had always ruled through strength, fear, and trophies. If humans could win hearts with nothing more than kindness and simple living, then the foundation of the empire would crack. Meanwhile, on Earth, the young woman continued to grow. She no longer lowered her head when she spoke. She had found her voice again, and her laughter had become more frequent. She helped Mason with small tasks in the town, and the local people began to know her not as a prize, but as a neighbor. Children waved at her in the streets, and she smiled in return. Each smile felt like a small act of defiance against the chains of her past. One evening, Mason noticed her quiet mood. She sat on the sofa, staring at the screen but not watching. He asked, "What troubles you?" She answered slowly, "The envoys from the empire. They looked at me as though I had betrayed them. But I did nothing wrong. I only lived." Mason nodded. That is enough. You are not theirs anymore. You do not need to prove anything. Her eyes softened. His words were simple, yet they carried strength. She realized that her worth was no longer tied to crowns or victories. She was valuable because she existed, because she could choose, because she could feel joy. Back in the palace, the royals planned their next move. They debated whether to demand her return, fearing that if she stayed on Earth, her story would inspire others. The idea of a prize choosing freedom was dangerous to rulers who built power on control. Yet none of them could deny the truth spreading across the stars: the woman was no longer a symbol of their conquest. She was becoming a symbol of humanity's quiet strength. And so the royals, who once believed they held all glory, found themselves shaken by the simple image of a woman on a sofa, resting without fear. They had crowns, armies, and palaces, yet it was a soldier's small home that had won her heart. The news of the envoy's report spread quickly across the empire. Whispers turned into anger, and anger turned into fear. The royals had given away what they called their greatest prize, yet now that prize was slipping from their grasp. To them, her life on earth was not peace but rebellion. They believed her freedom was an insult to their power. The king called his council together. She must return, he declared. The humans cannot keep what belongs to us. If she chooses their ways over ours, it will weaken our rule. We must remind the galaxy that loyalty cannot be taken from us so easily. The queen agreed, though her voice was calm and sharp. We gave her to show our strength. If she rejects us, it shows weakness. That cannot be allowed. Orders were sent. A royal ship was dispatched to Earth, not with weapons, but with demands. The envoys carried a message for both the humans and the young woman: she was to return to the Empire, where she belonged. When the ship landed, it caused a stir in the human settlement. Officials gathered, unsure how to respond. Mason stood quietly beside the young woman, his face calm but firm. He had expected this moment. The envoys entered Mason's home without hesitation. They looked around with disdain, their eyes falling on the sofa where she sat. One of them spoke loudly: "You have forgotten who you are. You were chosen as the prize of the Empire. You were given away as a gift of peace. You cannot stay here as if you are an ordinary person. Return with us at once." The young woman's hands tightened on the fabric of the sofa. Her heart beat quickly, but she did not lower her eyes. For the first time, she felt the strength to face them. Mason stood beside her silently, his presence steady as a wall. He did not speak for her. He waited, leaving the choice in her hands. She rose slowly from the sofa. Her voice trembled at first, but each word grew stronger. "I am not a prize. I am not a gift. I am not a symbol for your glory. I am a person. I have found peace here, and I will not return to chains." The envoys were stunned. They had expected silence, fear, or obedience. Instead, they heard defiance spoken with calm certainty. One envoy tried again. "You speak of peace, but you belong to the Empire. You cannot choose this life. It is not yours to decide." She lifted her chin. "It is mine. For the first time, it is mine. I sit where I wish. I laugh when I wish. I live as I wish. That is something you cannot take back from me." The officials from Earth who had gathered outside listened carefully. They had expected conflict, yet instead they witnessed a woman claiming her freedom in simple words. Her courage spread through the room like fire. Mason finally spoke, his voice calm. "You heard her. She has chosen. Humanity does not keep slaves. If she wishes to stay, she stays. The envoys glared at him, but they could not deny what had been said. They had no power to take her by force, not without breaking the fragile peace between the Empire and Earth. And so they left, their pride wounded, their message carried back to the royals. When the ship departed, silence filled the house. The young woman sank back onto the sofa, her hands trembling. Mason sat beside her, placing a glass of water on the table. She looked at him with eyes shining from both fear and relief. "I thought I would be too weak," she admitted softly. "You were not weak," Mason replied. "You stood for yourself. That is strength." Her heart swelled with something new, pride, not in what others had given her, but in what she had claimed. For the first time in her life, her future felt like her own. Far away, the royals received the report with anger. The queen listened to the envoy's words in silence, but deep inside, she understood what had happened. The empire had lost not because of weapons or armies, but because of something far greater. Humanity had shown a power they could not match, the power to let someone choose. The royals debated revenge, but even they feared the consequences. To strike at Earth now would show weakness, not strength. And so they were left with their crowns and their banners, but without the loyalty of the one they had once called a prize. On Earth, life slowly returned to its rhythm. The young woman began to walk in the town more freely. People greeted her not as a symbol, but as a neighbor. She helped in small ways, carrying water, sharing meals, watching children as they played. Each act made her feel more alive, more rooted in this new world. One evening, she sat again on the sofa, a blanket wrapped around her. Mason was beside her, watching the screen with a faint smile. She turned to him and whispered, "Thank you." He shook his head. "You do not owe me thanks. You made the choice. It was yours." Her eyes softened, and she leaned back against the cushions. The sofa, once just a strange seat, had become the place where her freedom had begun. It was where she had first rested without fear, where she had laughed again, and where she had stood up to her past. It was no longer only a piece of furniture. It was her symbol of peace, of strength, and of choice. And in that quiet home, with no crowns or chains, she discovered the true power of humanity. The weeks that followed felt different for the young woman. The weight that once clung to her shoulders had begun to lift. Each day carried a rhythm of peace that grew more natural. She no longer counted the hours in silence, waiting for commands. Instead, she filled them with small acts that gave her life meaning. The townspeople had grown used to her presence. At first, they had been curious, whispering about the alien guest who lived with Mason. But curiosity turned into welcome. They saw her not as a trophy from a faraway war, but as a quiet neighbor who offered gentle smiles and willing hands. She helped an old woman carry baskets from the market. She played simple games with children who laughed without fear of her strange appearance. She listened to stories told by farmers and workers, learning about human struggles and joys. Each act built a bond between her and the town. Slowly, she realized she was no longer seen as the prize. She was simply herself. Mason watched this change with quiet pride. He did not push her into it, he only gave her the space to find her own way. Sometimes he worked in the garden while she watered the plants. Other times they shared meals at the table, speaking about little things, weather, books, or the stories on the screen. Their conversations were not grand, but they carried warmth. The sofa remained her favorite place. It was where she felt safe, where her journey toward freedom had begun. She often sat there in the evenings, wrapped in a blanket, watching the glowing screen. Netflix became their shared ritual. Together, they laughed at comedies, gasped at dramas, and sometimes sat in silence when a story touched their hearts. To her, these moments were more powerful than the ceremonies of the empire's palace. They were real. One night, after a long day of helping in the town, she sat on the sofa and turned to Mason. Her voice was steady. "When I was taken, I thought I would never belong anywhere again. But here, in this small home, I have found something greater than belonging. I have found peace." Mason gave a small smile. "Peace is worth more than crowns." His words reminded her of the empire. She thought of the royals, still locked in their halls of marble and gold. They had power, but their hearts were chained to pride. She had been their prize, their proof of victory. Yet it was here, in a soldier's modest home, that she had won something they could never claim. The thought made her chest feel lighter. She had once been afraid to speak, afraid to laugh, afraid to hope. Now she spoke when she wished, laughed when she felt joy, and dreamed of a life that stretched beyond war. In time, she began to call Mason's house her own. She helped arrange the shelves, added small decorations she found in the market, and even planted flowers near the window. Each act left her mark on the place, turning it from a shelter into a home. The people of the town grew protective of her as well. When strangers came asking about her, the townsfolk answered with care, making it clear she was not to be treated as property. She was one of them, and they would stand beside her. Their kindness gave her strength, reminding her that she was no longer alone. One evening, as the sun set, she sat outside with Mason, watching the sky turn shades of red and gold. She spoke softly, "Do you think the empire will try again?" Mason looked at the horizon. "Maybe. But if they do, they will learn again that they cannot take what is freely chosen." She nodded, feeling the truth of his words. Her choice had already shaken the royals once. If they returned, she would stand firm again. She was no longer the silent figure paraded as a trophy. She was a woman who had chosen her own path. That night, as she lay on the sofa, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. From the halls of the palace to the quiet streets of Earth, her life had changed in ways she could never have imagined. She realized that her story was no longer about being a prize of war. It was about being human, even if she was not born one. Humanity had given her not chains, but choice. Not commands, but care. Not thrones, but a home. Her eyes closed, and she smiled faintly. She was no longer waiting for freedom. She was living it. The sofa beneath her, the stories on the screen, the laughter in the town, and the steady presence of Mason had given her something the royals could never understand. They had called her a prize, but here she had found something far greater. She had found forever.